Thanks, Naomi, and thanks everyone for coming along. I've got to give a shout out to some of my colleagues here today. The National Health Medical Research Council grant I'm working on is actually led by Dr. Monica Barrett, who I would say is definitely Australia, if not the world's leading authority on the harm reduction aspects of crypto markets. And Dr. Alexia Maddox as well. We're co-founding members of the Cryptomarkets Research Hub. And there's one other project that I'm working on as well, in addition to my research with Macquarie Uni. It's Australian Institute of Criminology research project where we're doing encrypted chat interviews with online drug dealers. We've got our first one lined up for this week, so we're quite excited to get that rolling. I've been working in this space since about 2012, which is nearly as long as these markets have really been around, certainly in their current sort of iteration. So the presentation today, I'm going to be whizzing through a fair bit of material. A lot of it's kind of general overview stuff. If you have questions, please feel free to interrupt if you like. And then, hopefully we'll have some time at the end as well. The presentation outline today, basically we're going to be talking about what are crypto markets, darknet marketplaces. A lot of people, even professionals working in the field, and certainly law enforcement still don't really have a great understanding of what these things are. So there'll be some general sort of overview, how they work. What are some of the implications for organised crime and also for law enforcement working in this area? A lot of these are hypothesized. We're still waiting to get the sort of in-depth, really qualitative research where we're doing interviews of the kind that I'm hopefully going to be doing later this week to try and answer some of these questions definitively. And then lastly, talking about some more recent research that has already been completed, looking into the extent and the composition of the darknet drugs trade that is located here in Australia. So, jumping straight in, what is a crypto market, also known as a darknet marketplace? That's a colloquial, kind of more popular name. This is the way that they're described often in the media as an eBay of illicit drugs. They're hosted on the darknet, which is a special encrypted subset of the internet. And the eBay of illicit drugs description is actually quite an accurate one, I think, in a lot of ways. It captures the essential way that these websites operate, because much like eBay, the administrators of these sites don't actually sell anything themselves. Okay? They just host the encrypted site infrastructure that allows people to come on, whether you're selling crack cocaine or heroin or more likely cannabis, ecstasy, drugs of that type. It allows you to come on, you create a seller profile on this page, and then people go and they can access your seller profile page. And we'll look at some examples of that in a second. They buy the drugs directly from the vendor. So the money gets paid initially into an escrow account to the crypto market administrator. Once the drugs arrive, that money is sent on to the drug dealer, and the drugs are sent directly from the dealer to the drug consumer. So there's no centralized warehouse, okay? Just the same way eBay works, just by connecting buyers and sellers. So these first three characteristics that we'd see, these would apply equally to eBay as they would to the darknet sites that we're looking at. These other three are what differentiates a legitimate trading website like eBay from a crypto market. So first up, reputation is very important, but for obvious reasons. People do not post their real names on these sites. They don't provide the real locations, except in a very approximate sense. They rely on the Tor network. This is essentially the anonymous web, the darknet. So using this Tor network browser, so the layman kind of version, if you can just download this stuff. Essentially, like it's like a different version, a 56K version of Safari or Google Chrome. Once you download that, it scrambles your IP address, which makes it not impossible, but very, very difficult for the authorities to tell who you are and where you're located and when you're sending information from. And lastly, the key kind of other pillar that makes these sites work is they use encrypted electronic currencies. So Bitcoin is the most popularly used one at the moment. There are other ones. Kanye West is one of my favorite ones.
So is that kind of like PayPal?
It's not like PayPal. It's
darknet PayPal?
You could, kind of. In how it works, it's a little bit more complicated. They have this blockchain technology, and I need to say at the outset, I'm not a computer scientist, so if you have any technical questions, you will need to forward them to some of my colleagues in the IT department. But yeah, basically it's an encrypted version that allows, again, a bit like the Tor network and the encryption that allows the darknet to run. The encryption isn't perfect, but it makes it very, very difficult for law enforcement authorities to try and trace these kind of transactions. So, has anyone actually been to a darknet website before? There's nothing illegal about accessing these sites, by the way. You can, yeah, okay, it's only a couple, right. Right, well, so this is what they look like, right? This is a screenshot from the original Silk Road one. This was the sort of pioneering crypto market. This was the one that certainly introduced it. I've got a message as well, yeah, that's right. It's probably from you. This is the original site, and you can see it's kind of laid out a bit like eBay is as well, right? So you've got the different product categories here, you got some messages, you count information, messages from the administrator of the site, some news. It's kind of mundane in a way, except when you actually look at the products and the product categories. So drugs were easily the biggest category of products sold on Silk Road. So you can see, you probably can't read this number, it's a little bit small, but at the time this screenshot was taken, 4,093. That's 4,093 different individual drug listings. Okay, so at the height of its operation, Silk Road had around 12,000, Silk Road 2 had around 17,000, and now the sites themselves, it's much more, well, there's a bunch of these sites in operation. None of them have the same market share that Silk Road had at that time, but the darknet drugs trade is bigger than it's ever been. So if you were to click on any single one of these things, you can see the prices listed in Bitcoins here. It's obviously convertible to Australian currency, depending on how you've got your account set up. If you were to click on one of these, you would see, oh, whoops. Oh, wait, I'll jump to that in a second, sorry. So Silk Road 1 was running for about 2.5 years. That was in full view of the DEA, the FBI, the AFP. I don't think the AFP really freaked these guys out that much compared to some of the law enforcement agencies that were already out to get them. But they really embarrassed these law enforcement agencies. It was a bit like the hunt for Osama bin Laden, that it really highlighted the limitations of state power. And when they actually eventually managed to track down the man responsible, it was not some sophisticated James Bond villain Spectre kind of organisation, but it was this guy. The rather dreamy looking Ross Ulbricht. I imagine Robert Pattinson will be playing him in the movie. He was a 20-something engineering dropout. He had no particular formal training in IT skills yet. Just by using this incredibly powerful and free encryption software was able to create a site where he amassed a personal fortune of around 80 million Bitcoins in just a couple of years. So the site was operating for about 2.5 years. The FBI finally managed to get their man. And they were very quick to announce that this was the beginning of the end for online illicit drug distribution, which it never really was. Silk Road 2 was up and running less than a month later. It very quickly eclipsed in size Silk Road 1. And one of the reasons for this is because it operates like eBay. Okay, so when they shut the site down, if you imagine you shut eBay down, all of those buyers and sellers are still out there. Okay, so all it takes is someone to come along to create a new site. Suddenly everyone starts registering new accounts. And this is one of the real problems for law enforcement. It's this classical kind of whack-a-mole analogy that you can shut down the site infrastructure, but all of these people, the demand and the suppliers are still there. So this is one of the longest running markets that I think is still in operation. This is still up, isn't it? Yeah, Dream Market. So you can see they're basically using exactly the same layout, exactly the same kind of structure as Silk Road. Little variations here and there, but fundamentally the business model that Silk Road and Ross Ulbricht, the founder of Silk Road, established is very much a viable one. So there's, well, there'll be a dozen, 2 dozen big crypto markets currently in operation. They're wink in and out of existence. Most of them that have gone offline haven't been due to law enforcement activity, but rather to exit scams. So these are administrators who run the site. As the sites grow and more funds are stored in that escrow account, that becomes a big temptation for whoever's running the site because these are essentially untraceable currencies. And one day they just shut the site and abscond to somewhere tropical, I imagine, with the money. So if you were to click on any one of those kind of user offers, you'd see something like this page. So this was from an Australian crypto market dealer. And you can see here some of the interesting rhetoric, I guess, the tone of these sites. And it's very much reminiscent of the kind of tone that you'd see from a legitimate corporate retailer. So you've got your priority-friendly, helpful customer service. You've got your loyalty bonus program for repeat customers. One of my favourites here is the Pride financial supporter of WikiLeaks and Blue Light. So you've got kind of a corporate social responsibility angle in there as well, but also one that's quite well tailored to the customer base. You imagine if you're going on to the darknet to buy illicit drugs, you probably would be a supporter of WikiLeaks and Blue Light. So you can see here as well, this is from a different vendor, these kind of gimmicks, Christmas sale, 10% off. You will see any kind of gimmick that you can imagine on these sites. So 2-for-1 specials, discounts for World Pop Day, whatever you like. You know, there's various lotteries and that sort of thing. And the reason that they do this is because these are incredibly competitive illicit drug markets. In fact, they're way more competitive than any conventional in-person conventional drug market. There's way more drug dealers concentrated in the one digital space than you'll ever find in any conventional illicit drug marketplace. So one of the ways that people manage the expectations of their customers is through the provision of terms and conditions of sale. So these are not legal contracts, obviously, because they're not legal transactions. But you can see here, so this vendor is basically telling his customers, wherever you're located, if you don't get your drugs in a week and you're located in Australia, don't get angry with us, don't give us a bad review, because we've said here at the outset, 10 to 19 days. And you'll have sometimes pages and pages of these terms and conditions, depending on how professional the drug vendor is. Interestingly, here you can see, hint, don't just throw away your junk mail. This speaks to the incredible stealth sophistication that a lot of these drug dealers have in concealing their drugs in the post. And we'll talk in a little bit more detail about that later on in the presentation. Refund policies, so these again are common across a lot of the top dealers working on these sites. Points to some of the differentiation you would see in conventional illicit drug markets. I doubt if you were to buy some cocaine off a dealer in a nightclub and you didn't think it was great quality, that you could go up and just ask for your money back. But this is not atypical on the darknet drug sites. And interestingly, you can see differentiation here for Australian customers. So they get a lower amount of refund. They won't do the reshipping, but they'll give 30% of your money back. When I presented some of this research to Australian customs, I thought they'd be quite happy that they're at least perceived to have this differentiation here, but they weren't particularly. Yeah, not much of a sense of humour there. But yeah, so this was another interesting kind of example here of ways in which drug dealers can kind of differentiate and build a brand. And that is one of the things that you do see. Is building a brand here, and usually that's done by claiming that we've got the best products, but you can see these example here. This is, again, a kind of corporate social responsibility. Not exactly typical on these sites, but you do see this stuff. And if you supplemented, say, opium here with coffee or chocolate, then you can start to see that they're tapping into an existing sentiment that they believe is there with their customers. So the fair trade, and the not financing of violent drug cartels. And it's interesting. I mean, I would say to take any of these claims with a grain of salt. We know that these kind of certifications are difficult enough to guarantee in the conventional economy where we've got transparent supply chains. But they do speak to what dealers think about their customers. And if you're a cocaine dealer, a cocaine consumer, why not? Why not have fair trade cocaine? You might be a consumer of other fair trade products, and if you believe that you can get your drugs without the kind of involvement that we see in the Mexican cartel wars, then why not indeed? So, customer feedback is a critically important aspect of how crypto markets function, and this really is tapping into a digital trend that we see across the legitimate economy as well. So from Uber to Google reviews or Yelp, this whole idea of incorporating the customer and getting the customer to become a contributor very much to the stability of the scheme. So this kind of feedback, it takes a few different forms, and this is common across crypto markets. You have a rating out of 5 stars, you have a review, textual comments, sometimes very clearly written by people who are on drugs at the time, and then usually freshness as well, so we can see how old the review is. This kind of 5 out of 5 review scale or level of quality feedback is pretty common for the top dealers. The dealers basically will do anything that they can to avoid getting a bad review, because this is the main mechanism by which dealers compete online. So getting a bad review can knock that dealer down the ladder of different dealers, and if there's, say, 300, 400, 500 people selling ecstasy, for example, any drop down that and anything that damages customer perceptions has the potential to impact your business in a negative way. From a research perspective, the fact that this information is here and it's publicly available is a gold mine. And this is the source of a lot of the data that we've analysed and scooped off these sites that I'll be presenting towards the end of the presentation. So one of the other things that you'll see on these sites are discussion forums. And I think one that's probably particularly relevant to the people here today is this one here. So these are all framed slightly differently on the various crypto markets, but drugs talk, drug safety, these are the kind of places where people talk about ways in which you can consume illicit drugs, prepare illicit drugs more safely. Silk Road 1 actually had, in the end, a doctor who was on the payroll, who was getting paid anonymously in bitcoins, who would take questions, sometimes quite complicated questions from drug users about safer ways to consume drugs. So, for example, there was one topic post where someone said, I'm on chemotherapy, but I'm also addicted to heroin. You know, what is the safest way that I can manage my drug use in an environment like that? It's also where drug users talk about scams that take place, dodgy products, that sort of thing. So one of the real harm reduction benefits, and something we're trying to quantify a bit more precisely, is the impact of having access to this kind of information at the same place that you can buy the drugs. So we know that through these sites, people typically get higher quality drugs than they get on the street, but they also get access to this kind of information as well. So important avenues for harm reduction there. Right, this is a slide I used to scare my first years. This was a social network analysis map by some colleagues of ours, Ali Mam and Gisela Bickler. This is a map of a conventional illicit drug distribution network operating in the United States. And it points to what the police are really up against. Good timing on that. What the police are up against in trying to crack down on the illicit drugs trade. And it really points to the futility, I think, as well, in a lot of conventional law enforcement strategies. And that is when you're looking at a network analysis map like this, you could take out a third, you could take out even more than that. You could take out half of those individual participants or organizations represented in each of these nodes, right from the point of production, transportation, people who finance it, the parasites, the standover men, the security firms, right through to the retailers on the street, and these networks will still function. Okay, so much like the internet, these decentralized exchange networks are incredibly durable. Right? So the internet was originally developed back in the 70s and 80s as a way for communication systems to work in the event of nuclear conflict. So you could take out various communication nodes, but signals, communications would still find a way through whatever remaining nodes were there. And these conventional illicit drug distribution networks we see operate in much the same way. They're incredibly durable, but that durability comes at a cost. And one of those is network inefficiency. So if you think of a supply chain, right? So any supply chain getting goods from A to B, the longer that supply chain is, the more links in that chain of supply, the more inefficient the network becomes. And that inefficiency results in two different things. We've got price increases and product adulteration. So the longer a distribution chain is, each person who is a participant in that conventional drug supply chain wants some compensation, right? So they buy the drugs for 5 and they sell them for 10. And that price increase is eventually passed on to an end consumer. Right? And the price increase will be the eventual final retail price will reflect how many links in the chain of supply there is. This also happens in terms of product adulteration. So I could buy it for 5 and sell it for 5, but also increase my money if I buy 5 kilos but I sell 10. Right? So I cut the chemicals, usually with an inert substance. Okay? The idea that people put rat poison, deliberately poison their customers is largely a myth, although of course we've had instances more recently of drugs that shouldn't be in there having some very disastrous outcomes. So when we see the implications of the growth of these online drug distribution networks, it's the reason I'm giving you this background information, is a look at some of the networks that we see or that we hypothesize seeing on the darknet. And there's three different models that we've come up with at the moment to try and imagine how the drugs are actually getting from point A to point B. And the first of these, and the most radical, is the producer to consumer model. So these are people who are actually making the drugs themselves, very close to the point of production or the point of cultivation, and they can send drugs for the first time directly to their consumers. Right? So if you're growing pot at your house, or you've got a warehouse where you're doing it, usually that would be quite a risky thing to be selling to end consumers, right? Because any one of those could be an undercover police officer, or they could be a standover man, right? They could be someone who knows that you're outside of police protection, and all they need to do is do a chopper read on you, come around, chop off your toes, and you'll eventually give up your stash, your money and your drugs, and they can carry on their business, and there's not much they can do about it. Online, this is not the case. Anyone who's selling illicit drugs online would assume that any one of their customers could be an undercover police officer, yet because of the encryption that they use, they're not particularly worried about it. Okay? So what we see here is, instead of having a mid-level wholesaler, a mid-level retailer, all these other different layers in the supply chain, the drugs can get from point A to point B in a much more simple fashion. And because of that, the drugs can be more pure, and they can also be cheaper than what we'd see through a conventional illicit drug distribution network. One of the more likely models that we think we'd see is more a wholesaler to consumer model. Okay, so rather than the drugs being directly sold from that point of production or cultivation, that it goes a little bit more down the chain of supply and then is at the wholesale or mid-level dealer kind of level. The interesting thing about this is it still cuts out some really important levels of the supply chain. So particularly if you're buying your drugs from overseas. So if I want to buy some ecstasy, for example, instead of buying it at a nightclub, if I buy it from a dealer who's located in the Netherlands or the UK, it's bypassing an international trafficker, it's bypassing a domestic wholesaler, a mid-level dealer, and a street retailer at a minimum. Okay? And because of that, the drugs are cheaper and likely more powerful as well. And the interesting thing about this, so one of the things, and this I think is interesting for people who maybe aren't sympathetic to drug legalization arguments, people who think drugs are bad in and of themselves, the formation of these kind of networks has actually got benefits for those people as well, because you're talking about cutting out a lot of the organised crime activity, at least in this country, with the formation of these kind of networks. Okay, so if you are an organised crime group who is making your money out of smuggling ecstasy into the country and then selling it on onto the street, this is the worst thing in the world that you can imagine, right? Because you are cut out of the supply chain entirely. So it's got very significant potential to actually reduce a lot of the organised crime activity in this country. The last model that we see is a business-to-business model. So this is when drug dealers, online dealers, or online consumers rather, instead of buying drugs on a crypto market to consume themselves, they buy the drugs to actually go out and to sell back into the legitimate economy. So this is a way in which, say, if you want to sell drugs, instead of sourcing them from your bikie gangs or your organised crime groups, you can actually source them online, usually quite cheaper as well. If you're getting them from an international source, then you may be able to get from a conventional organised crime source for your illicit drugs. So you're still bypassing these international traffickers, and in doing that, you're eliminating some of the most profitable bottlenecks in conventional illicit drug supply chain networks. And this, of course, is going to be particularly relevant for people who don't actually have the capacity to buy illicit drugs directly on the darknet themselves. So if you're a homeless heroin user, for example, chances are you don't have a computer, a bank account that you can put Bitcoins into, or a Bitcoin wallet. But that doesn't necessarily mean that your heroin isn't actually being sourced off the darknet somewhere, because your dealer could be buying this stuff on the darknet. Okay, so talking about some of the challenges police face in this area. Police and law enforcement agencies. One of the big problems, and one of the first things that people ask when you tell them how these darknet websites work, is people can't get their heads around so it just goes in the post? You get it sent directly to your house? How do people not detect these things in the mail? Well, The simple answer is that people usually vastly overestimate the capacities of law enforcement to detect drugs at the border, and particularly they overestimate the capacities to detect drugs once they're already in the country. So we know, of course, there are scanning procedures. Australia's got quite well-developed ones, or certainly they're perceived to be very well-developed at the border, but inside Australia, scanning capacities are very minimal indeed. At the same time, we've also seen big increases in the volume of legitimate trade, a lot of it fueled by internet purchasing in the conventional economy. So there's a lot more of these sort of bulkier packages travelling around. Customs use, to try and find the proverbial needle in the haystack here, as the haystack is getting bigger, customs use what they call risk matrices to try and identify what postal packages are there, what are the ones most likely to contain illicit drugs. And they do this essentially by raising red flags. So can anyone have a think about what might constitute a red flag if you're a customs person thinking about how to best concentrate your resources there? Smell? Yep. So if there's some odour, if it's leaking, some fluid somewhere. Netherlands, yeah. Okay, so Netherlands, Colombia, right? Yeah. So yeah, there exactly. Those kind of things. So if it raises enough red flags, then it's likely to be inspected in a bit more detail, perhaps even open, perhaps have a sniffer dog running over it. There are other things that I wouldn't have guessed that would constitute red flags. So things like having a handwritten address is enough to constitute a red flag. The reason for that is because the vast majority of postal traffic that's out there is commercial in nature. It's got proper printed envelope. The reason I know that it's a red flag, though, is because the risk profiles that customs use have been leaked online and they've been posted on crypto market discussion forums in the past. So what that means is the dealers are now creating and sharing their own body of counter-interdiction intelligence. It used to be customs, law enforcement agencies were the only ones who were compiling this kind of intelligence and sharing it with one another, but now we see the offenders starting to do that as well. So while customs is continually improving in their ability to detect illicit drugs online, so too are the drug dealers now having real advanced capacities in knowing exactly what customs are looking for. So if you buy drugs off the darknet from one of these top dealers, it will not come with a handwritten address as a result. There'll be significant stealth measures taken. There's other things that make it more likely that it won't be detected in the post. One of them is these competitive vendor rankings. So because crypto markets are such a competitive space, because customers are constantly reviewing their drug dealers, the drug dealers who rise to the top are the ones who get the best rankings, and they're the ones that can conceal their drugs in a most sophisticated manner and actually get them from point A to point B. So there's a real capitalist underpinning here that is rewarding good drug dealers, and they're the ones who are effective in stealth. We've had leaked customs documentation, online forum communications. So if you were to sell illicit drugs online, you don't need to start from the beginning. You can just jump onto one of these crypto markets, and there are detailed how to defeat Australian customs threads in there, how to defeat drug detection dogs. All these different things are already there, and you can access this. One of the other things as well is that most online drug purchases are small. Okay, so there have been a few estimations done here. One of the original ones by Nicholas Christen was that most crypto market purchases are around $200 in value. So we'll be talking about a couple of grams of cocaine, 10-pack of pills. That's not particularly easy to pick up in the post. Okay, that fits in a normal business kind of envelope, in a Christmas card, whatever you like. All right, so the needle that you're looking for in the haystack isn't a particularly big one. Now, let's just say that customs get lucky. They actually manage to intercept something in the post. Does that actually mean that that's going to result in something productive that the police can use? And the answer is not particularly, not compared at least to a lot of conventional illicit drug policing strategies. So most illicit drug policing, certainly the backbone operations of the war on drugs, have been things like buy-bust operations. So you've got an undercover officer, he's buying drugs off a drug dealer, and once the transaction is complete, usually some sort of surveillance going on as well, then the badge comes out, the cuffs go on, and that's a pretty compelling package that you can present in court right there. You've got the drugs, you've got the money, you've got some sort of surveillance, you've got the offender, everything's right there, and you can present that in court and you'll likely get a conviction. If law enforcement actually managed to get a intercept, say, a package with a gram of cocaine in it, what does that actually mean? Is that going to result in a charge? Well, from a law enforcement perspective, that's tricky to actually convert that amount of evidence into a conviction in court. The name on the address is not necessarily the one that you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt on courtroom is the person who ordered the drugs, particularly because we've had this encryption. You've got the financial transaction is encrypted, there's no record of that. You've got the Tor encryption, which suggests that, which again prevents any kind of evidence about someone actually ordering drugs online. All you've got is this envelope and an address. You could kick someone's door in, install sort of surveillance in someone's house to see if they open up the drugs, start snorting the cocaine. But for a gram of cocaine, is it really a wise use of police resources? Is it something that they can justify using on any kind of wide scale? Unlikely. Okay. So for these kind of small purchases, the risks would probably be likely quite low. Particularly, also, because a successful prosecution doesn't actually necessarily go anywhere, okay? Because even if someone confesses, yes, I bought the illicit drugs online, where did you buy them? I bought them from dealer 66, he's in the Netherlands somewhere, right? The chance of turning that into any kind of conviction following up the chain of supply is very small indeed. As a result of this, we've seen law enforcement efforts targeting the darknet become a bit more technologically sophisticated. So Operation Onymous was one of, last year, year before? Can't remember. 2 years ago now, yeah. This was probably the first big cyber investigation post-Silk Road. We still don't know exactly how they did it, but targeting vulnerabilities in Tor or in Bitcoin somewhere, and it resulted in the mass shutdown of 27 crypto markets, including some of the biggest ones in operation. So Silk Road 2 was amongst those. This was a massive transnational policing operation. It involved 16 different countries and some of the really big policing, national and transnational policing agencies, particularly in the US and Europe. Where this was touted as a massive success, but when you look at an operation of this size and you look at actually what they got, you got 18 arrests worldwide and a seizure of $1 million. That's not particularly big when we think about a lot of the drug seizures of conventional illicit drug traders that we see here. And particularly, these sites were shut down, but we didn't see any lasting impact on the illicit drugs trade because once these sites were shut down, there were obviously problems in the encryption somewhere, but not so fundamental that new crypto markets didn't immediately emerge. Okay? And a lot of the top dealers on these sites, they don't just have one dealer, they don't just stick to one crypto market, they'll have different seller pages on 5 of the 6 different crypto markets in operation. So we didn't even know if we actually inconvenienced any single drug dealers with this, because their customers, instead of going to their usual site to access their favorite drug dealer, had to go to a different site instead. Okay, so the last bit of the presentation I want to talk about is some of the information that my research team and I have been gathering off the darknet, analysing basically the customer feedback and the information that we looked at on the seller pages there. So as we looked at, there's a huge amount of publicly available information. We know where dealers are located usually. They list the country in which they're located. They tell us how much they're selling their drugs for. We can tell by looking at the customer feedback what the perceived quality is, how frequently they're doing their drug deals. And all this is information that we can use these automated software crawlers to go up, hoover up, and then we can start to do some quantitative analysis. So this was a snapshot taken about 8 months ago now, 9 months ago. And we identified 152 darknet drug dealers who located Australia as their location. So not particularly high in gross numbers, but the second highest per capita concentration of darknet drug dealers anywhere in the world, just behind the Netherlands. The interesting differentiation with the Netherlands, while most of the Netherlands was intended for international trade, so Netherlands being cosmopolitan, an entrepreneurial bunch are sending their drugs that are sourced in the Netherlands out across the whole world, we had the world's highest proportion of domestic-only sales. So over 90% of the drugs sold by illicit drug traders here, at least 90%, are not being sold internationally, they're being sold domestically within Australia. So yeah, that's our selection of the pie chart here. So we constitute 7.2% of the world's darknet drug marketplace. Okay, so what's actually being sold? Well, this kind of mirrors in a lot of ways patterns of illicit drug consumption more generally. So cannabis, okay, my categories haven't come up here for some reason. So cannabis being the biggest one, prescription drugs, so that is steadily growing. That's the fastest growing category of illicit drug sales on the darknet. So that's anything from Valium, Xanax, right through to things like steroids. So quite a broad selection of categories, products rather. Ecstasy, methamphetamine, even old school amphetamine sneaks into the top 8 at just about 1% there. Now, how this sits in international terms. So Australia, we've got here, we constitute 6.7% of the transactions that are conducted on the darknet. So we'd expect roughly 6.7 across all of these categories here. So prescription drugs is roughly proportional, opioids slightly higher, psychedelics slightly lower. But methamphetamine is the really interesting one. So we can see here nearly 30% of the world's darknet methamphetamine trade is conducted by dealers, darknet drug dealers located in Australia. So we're punching significantly above our weight in this particular illicit drug category. Much lower for amphetamine and a bit higher for ecstasy as well. Okay, so prices. This is quite interesting. So at the top here, these are prices by international crypto market dealers, so crypto market dealers who are located outside of Australia. This middle bar here is crypto market dealers who are located inside the country, and then just for comparative purposes, we've got the average street prices from the EDRS at UNSW or at NDARC, who produce these numbers about street prices here. The little crosses in the middle are average, and then we've got the percentiles, 25th to 75th percentiles either side. And you can see for cannabis, Australian prices are pretty much in line with the international average. Cannabis prices in this country are pretty much the only reasonably priced illicit drugs that you can get in this country in international comparative terms. So the average price slightly lower than the street price, but everything's basically within the range of what we would expect for these kind of illicit drugs. When we look at MDMA, on the other hand, we see some really interesting divergences take place. So the first thing you'll notice is there's a massive difference between the price of MDMA that's sold by foreign crypto market drug vendors and MDMA that is sold by local darknet drug dealers. And the interesting thing is here as well, the numbers suggest that the prices on average are slightly higher on the darknet than they are from your average street dealer, although still within the range of what we would expect. The reasons for this, we think, is because people believe that you can get higher quality MDMA on the darknet that you can on the street, although we need further research to confirm this. Cocaine and methamphetamine, again, so with all the illicit drugs apart from methamphetamine, you get this really, really significant divergence between what a foreign vendor is going to sell you and what a local darknet vendor is going to sell you. So if you want to buy and encourage, well, I'd encourage you to consider the risks. And this is basically what the risk is in financial terms. This is how much extra people pay to not run the risk of their drugs being intercepted by customs. So we call this, the difference here in all these international and domestic terms, we call that a risk tariff, because this is essentially what local dealers can charge in addition because their industry is effectively insulated by local law enforcement at the border. Okay? It's effectively functioning like a tariff, like some sort of trade protection. And this is one of the counterintuitive, unintended, we assume, side effects of having what is perceived to be a very strong border, and that is that local organised crime groups are effectively shielded from foreign competition. Okay? It allows them to take more money from their customers and to stay in business and to profit, because if that effective border wasn't there, there's no reason that someone would be paying that much more, 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 times the price for their illicit drugs when they can buy them much cheaper overseas. These differences are really most stark in the methamphetamine trade. And you can see here, one of the interesting things that we think dealers are doing, or online drug vendors are doing, particularly in the methamphetamine space, this seems likely, is that methamphetamine darknet dealers may not even be supplied by local organised crime groups. They can actually buy the drugs directly from a foreign crypto market vendor, double the price, and then sell it themselves on the darknet. And they never need to meet anyone, they never need to be exposed to organised crime groups or to law enforcement, people undercover. They can use this darknet encryption the whole time. They never need to meet anyone. So a relatively low risk way of doing your operation there, provided that you're aware of the operational security and the IT factors. But also much cheaper than selling drugs on the street. Okay, so the methamphetamine that you can get on the darknet, significantly cheaper, even from a local vendor, significantly cheaper than you can on the street. And we've been trying to figure out ways for this until we actually get some Australian methamphetamine darknet dealers to talk to us, which we're hoping to achieve at the moment. We won't be able to figure out exactly why this is, but one of the reasons we suspect is that it's safer for darknet dealers to do this. Okay? They don't need to charge as much in compensation because they're not worried about the bikie gangs coming in and stealing their stuff or hurting them, and they're not so worried about police as well. Okay, so we're getting towards the end here. So just wrapping up some of the harm reduction points that we wanted to emphasise. So the crypto markets, online illicit drug trading in general, can reduce harm in a couple of different ways. So first up, and this is stuff that Monica and I are hoping to quantify in some more detail, is through access to higher quality illicit drugs. Not always safer, of course, because more potent illicit drugs can lead to easier overdoses, but this can be offset, we believe, this danger by access to these discussion forums and by dealers providing more information about the illicit drugs that they're selling, so they can give dosage recommendations, what have you, at that initial point of sale. One of the things that Monica's found in her research as well is that the people's experience of buying illicit drugs online is that they experience fewer instances and actual manifestation of violence in the process of buying illicit drugs. And this holds true even for, say, cannabis and ecstasy distribution, which generally involves pretty low levels of violence anyway. We've got closed distribution networks, and people don't usually encounter high levels of violence. An important one as well is this elimination of violence between the drug retailers. And this is one of the things I'm particularly interested in from a criminological perspective, is this impact that it's having on organised crime groups. So we saw some of the ways in which the drug dealers on the darknet compete with one another, and that is through these really kind of essentially the same way that normal corporate retailers compete with one another. They compete in terms of price, they compete in terms of customer service, offering a positive customer experience, and through all those different gimmicks that we saw. They can't compete critically using violence because they don't know where anyone's located. Okay? They never physically interact with the customers, they don't know where each other are located, and that makes it much safer for a drug dealer. People might go, okay, well, why is that a good thing? Do we want to make things safer for drug dealers? Well, from a public safety point of view, yeah, I think you do, because you've got fewer instances of drug dealers going out there buying guns, maybe robbing other drug dealers or for self-protection, and that sucking up of the violence, removing the violence from the illicit drug trade, the gentrification of the illicit drug trade that is being produced by crypto markets, I would argue, is a net positive regardless of where you're coming from. So there's some other points of benefit here as well, and this is in this reconfiguration of the drug distribution networks. So if you're selling drugs on the darknet, at the very least, you're eliminating that retail section. You are the retail section. So those drugs aren't being sold on the street unless they're being purchased by someone who wants to on-sell them. Right? So fewer drugs being sold on the street, or if you're buying the drugs directly from overseas, you're prepared to run the risk that they might be intercepted by law enforcement, relatively low risk, we'd argue in a lot of circumstances. Then you're also eliminating all of these other groups, the international traffickers, the wholesalers, the mid-level dealers, in addition to the retailers. So I think one of the ways that that you can conceptualise this is the organised crime groups, your big bikie gangs, your mafia organisations, they kind of represent the Myers and the David Jones of the illicit drug world. But back in the 1990s, before online retailing became a big thing, and if you go back in that time, the big retailers, when they started seeing people selling sunglasses or shoes online, said this isn't going to take off, right? People are always going to want to come into a department store. And of course we haven't seen that, right? Those big department stores have seen a massive reduction in business because of this direct access that consumers have to retailers online. And I think really this is the real potential of crypto markets, is that they have the potential to render redundant or significantly reduce the power of organised crime groups, because they reduce the usefulness of violence. Violence will not help you compete on the darknet, and it facilitates these smaller players who don't need massive amounts of capital to get drugs into the country. Okay, so this is the final slide. Thanks everyone for paying attention. We can see that crypto market trading in Australia is significantly isolated from the international world. We don't know how many drugs are coming into the country from foreign darknet dealers, but we know that the drugs being sold by darknet drug dealers here are largely staying within the country. We suspect that there's very few drugs going out of the country from our own darknet dealers because of the differences in price that we saw. Okay, it's not competitive if you're a local darknet dealer to sell drugs internationally. And the interesting thing is with this price, as we talked about before, a lot of this isolation is due to the perceived effectiveness of our borders. Right? Having those strong borders there might sound good in the tabloids, but there are significant effects in keeping these local organised crime groups in profit as a result. But we need to do more research, of course, to substantiate these findings. And that's it. Thanks very much for your attention.